Physics. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about metaphysical fundamentality and its relation to mereological composition. More specifically, I'm going to talk to you about a family of views according to which the fundamental constituents of reality build the world and everything in it by mereological composition. And basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a combination of claims that someone who's attracted to this kind of view might be tempted to accept, and suggest that accepting all of these claims is going to lead to an unacceptable consequence. And this consequence is that all there exists are the fundamental constituents, whatever they may be, and a single whole that those constituents mereologically compose. And I sort of have been thinking about what exactly the upshot of the argument is, but here's sort of where I'm at now. I think the upshot is that there's a tension between, on the one hand, the thought that the world is this massive particular that's composed of all the things in it, including the fundamental constituents, and the thought that it may just turn out that the fundamental constituents of reality are not spatial temporally located particulars, but more something like properties. Okay, so here's the plan. So I'm going to first say a few things about building theoretic approaches to fundamentality. And I'm also going to say something about mereological generalist monism, which is the view that the only fundamental building relation is mereological composition. And then I'm going to draw on L.A. Pauw's mereological generalist monist view and say a few things about an intuition that supposedly motivates these sorts of views. And I'm going to think about what's the best way to think about this motivation in terms of our best formal theories of parthood. After that, I'm going to think about how the mereological generalist monist should think about the fundamental constituents of reality and how they relate to everything else. And basically, I'm going to suggest that whether we think that there are something like space-time points or whether we think that there's something like properties or qualities is going to impact how we should think about how these fundamental composition relations behave. And I'm going to then show that the combination of these claims is going to entail the problematic consequence that I mentioned at the beginning. And then I'm going to close by looking at how the mereological generalist monist could avoid this problem. And I'm going to suggest a couple of general lessons about the mereological generalist monist picture that this consequence sort of brings up. Okay, so let me start by saying something about building theoretic approaches to fundamentality. So on the building theoretic picture, the fundamental constituents of reality are the things that build or construct or otherwise make up everything else. The idea here is that fundamental structure is understood as a kind of construction structure. We investigate the hierarchical structure of our ontology and, i.e. things that exist by looking at which things build what and how those things are built. The most ideologically parsimonious version of building theory is the generalist monism. The generalist monists think that there's precisely one building relation. There's precisely one basic way in which the world and the things in it get built out of the fundamental constituents. And this gives their metaphysics a maximally parsimonious fundamental ideology. They only need one kind of basic relation to account for the fundamental ontological structure of reality. Now, there's like a lot of different candidates you might think is the one building relation if you are a generalist monist. So Hannah Brenner in her book has kind of a helpful listing. She's got relations like mereological composition, set formation, material constitution, determination, and grounding. But the kind of generalist monists that I'm interested in here are the ones who think that this single building relation is mereological composition. So I'm going to call these mereological generalist monists. And basically, the mereological generalist monist constitutes fundamental ontological structure as compositional structure as understood by our formal theories of parthood. Essentially, the thought is that the way in which the world is built from its fundamental building blocks is in important respects analogous to the way ordinary objects are standardly thought to be built from their proper parts. If you want to put this in a slogan, the mereological generalist monist thinks that fundamental structure is mereological structure. An explanation of the fundamental structure of the world is in important respects analogous to an explanation of the partial structure of an ordinary object. Okay, so now one of the most worked out mereological generalist monist accounts is L.A. Pauw's mereological bundle theory. And in her discussion of mereological generalist monism more generally, Pauw presents what she thinks is an important pre-theoretical motivation for accepting a form of mereological generalist monism. And this is what she calls the composition intuition, or CI, as I've labeled on your handouts. And basically, the composition intuition is best thought as something like a desire or a pre-theoretical commitment to accept the claim that the world is a particular whole that its fundamental constituents build by mereological composition. And the thought here is that this claim is going to motivate the thought that we may understand the fundamental metaphysical structure of reality as mereological structure. Because by thinking of reality as this massive particular, the mereological generalist monist could take literally the thought that fundamental structure of reality is compositional structure. And it also links nicely with this often used metaphor of joints in the nature that people have for fundamental structure. Joints, after all, connect bones into something larger, larger overall bone structure. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that if you the only way to be a mereological generalist monist is to accept the composition intuition. I'm not saying that if you're a mereological generalist monist, you're committed to the claim that there is this one single massive particular and that massive particular is the world. Rather, the thought is that if you think that something like the composition intuition is some attractive, claim to accept, like I sort of in some ways think that's going to naturally lead to you into a mereological generalist monist picture of fundamentality. Okay, so as I said before, the mereological generalist monist gives like gives an account of the fundamental structure of reality in terms of formal theories of partout. So I'll now think about how exactly the mereological generalist monist should capture the composition intuition in terms of a semi-formal theory of partout. And so to give a mereological account of building and to understand the composition intuition, what we need is a mereology. We need something that tells us how partout and composition relations behave formally. Now, for the purpose of my paper here, I'm going to suppose that we're working with a weak or a conservative mereology that's sometimes known in the literature as a minimal mereology. So I've got a couple of reasons why I'm working with this. So the first reason is that's kind of the mereology that Paul is working with. But also a minimal mereology is like a really conservative mereology because it only, aside from the standard definitions of partout and composition relations, it only includes one principle that governs the behavior of partout relations. And so you can get stronger mereologies, so like the notorious classical extensional mereology, by supplementing minimal mereology with some further axioms. Therefore, what I'm going to say in what follows is going to apply even if you are a mereological generalist monist who wants to accept some stronger version of a mereology. And just for clarity, the definitions I've got on the handout are formatted in a first order plural logic. But as far as I can tell, anything that I say is compatible with alternative formulations of mereologies, say in terms of a first order singular logic plus set theory or a second order logic. So a minimal mereology is basically just gives you the usual definition of a proper partout as a irreflexive, transitive, and antisymmetric binary relation. You then get the usual definitions of partout and overlap. And the one further constraint to the behavior of partout relations that you get on a minimal mereology is the principle of weak supplementation. It's basically a principle of decomposition, and it says, among other things, that anything that has proper parts has at least two. So you can't compose anything into only one thing. It says a bit more, but those technical details don't really matter for my purposes here. Okay, so let's now move on to think about the notion of composition. Well, the standard way of understanding composition in formal mereology is in terms of the notion of a mereological sum or fusion. So there are some alternative definitions of fusions that are especially relevant when we think about mereologies that don't have the weak supplementation axiom. But sort of perhaps the most common that you find in the literature is the one I've got on your handouts. And it basically says that something is a fusion of some other things, some things, precisely when each of the latter things is a part of the former thing, and every part of the former thing overlaps at least one of the latter things. And composition is standardly defined as the converse relation of fusion. So you say the y's compose x if and only if x fuses the y's. Okay, so the standard way of understanding mereological composition, as I've just presented, is going to require a slight revision for the purposes of the mereological generalist monist. And this is because, as it's kind of well known, on these above definitions, it follows that everything fuses itself, and therefore everything composes itself. The proof of this is kind of, as I said, known, and so I'm going to go through it. But if you're interested in details, my sort of ugly version of it is on your handouts in a footnote. But if you don't care, you can just take my word for it. Okay, so why is it bad if composition is, as you might say, a reflexive relation for the mereological generalist monist? Well, I think there's two important reasons. So I think the first reason is that it is not clear that a reflexive definition of composition is quite what we have in mind when we have a pre-theoretical notion of composition. I think there's something at least a bit weird in thinking that everything composes itself. It's a bit weird to say that I compose myself, and the glass composes the water glass composes itself. And if so, there's kind of worry about the composition intuition and whether the notion of composition that the composition intuition mentions is the same as this kind of reflexive notion of composition. But I think for more important reason why reflexivity is a bad thing to build into our notion of composition is that, as I'm going to sort of discuss in detail a bit later, an attractive way of thinking about fundamental constituents of reality on a building theoretic picture is as the unbuilt builders. That is, it's attractive to think of the fundamental constituent of reality as the things that build everything else and that are themselves unbuilt. However, this line of thought, namely the latter condition that the fundamental constituents of reality are not built, it's not consistent with a mereological generalist monist picture if building is composition and composition is reflexive, because then it follows that not just that the fundamental constituents are built, but everything is both built and a builder, right? Because composition is reflexive. Everything builds itself and everything is built by itself. Now, I think there's a simple way of revising this standard notion of fusion and composition that is going to avoid precisely these worries. So what basically I'm suggesting is that we need a notion of fusion and composition that makes it an irreflexive relation. We need a notion of composition that excludes things from composing themselves. So we want a notion of proper fusing and proper composition that stands to fusing and composition as proper parthood stands to parthood. And like a simple and elegant way of doing this is just by replacing the part in the first conjunct of fusion, as I got in your handout, with a proper part. I've labeled this claim as proper fusion in your handout and the corresponding notion of composition as proper composition. And I think proper fusion is a natural extension of the above notion of fusion. Analogously to proper parthood and parthood, on this notion, it turns out that every proper fusion is a fusion, but not every fusion is a proper fusion. What's more, since proper parthood is an irreflexive relation, proper fusion is going to restrict any things that properly compose some further thing from including that thing itself. So it turns out that nothing properly composes itself, and nothing is among some things that properly compose it. So you get an irreflexive notion of composition. And the final mereological notion I need for our purpose today is the notion of the world. So the standard one you find in the literature in mereology is as the thing that has everything as its parts, or equally the thing that is the maximal fusion, but not a proper fusion. So this standard definition you find in the literature, if you're sort of familiar with David Lewis's work in like possible worlds, this is precisely his notion of what is a possible world. It's a maximal mereological sum. And if you put all these notions together, we have now a way of understanding the composition intuition more specifically. And this is the claim I've got in a handout as CIM. So what that says that there's something that has everything as its part, and that thing is properly composed by the fundamental constituents. Okay, so that's all the mereology that we'll need for today. So let's now think about how the mereological generalist merge should think about the fundamental constituents of reality. Well, as I've sort of mentioned before, building theoretical closures to fundamentality are naturally paired with the conception of the fundamental as the unbuilt builders. So if you think that there is a fundamental bottom level and everything is kind of you get fundamental structures just by kind of going up from the fundamental level, that's sort of a claim. That is, if you think that building and fundamentality are well founded, on a mereological generalist monist picture, that is going to commit you the two claims I got in your handout from Bennett, and these are independence and completeness. So independence just says that nothing that's fundamental is properly composed, and completeness just says that everything that's not fundamental is properly composed of some things that are fundamental. So just to be kind of clear, so one of the reasons why I think independence is a really nice condition is that it precisely gets us a bottom layer of fundamentality. And that's because it entails the fundamental constituents are mereologically simple, so they don't have proper parts. Conversely, completeness is going to entail that everything that's not fundamental is mereologically complex. So everything that's not fundamental is going to have proper parts. So I think these are kind of any mereological generalist monist is likely to want to accept these claims as long as they think building is well founded in the sense I've mentioned. Now, mereological generalist monism as such is neutral about what sort of things, kind of metaphysically speaking, the fundamental constituents are. Because if you look up through what I've sort of the labeled claims I've got so far, all these principles are principles that govern the structural features of our ontology, like how kind of fundamentality structure is, but they don't say anything as such about the metaphysics of the things that are in this structure, right? However, I want to now suggest that the way that mereological generalist monist metaphysically characterizes the fundamental constituents of reality can lead to commitments about how composition behaves. So I think L.A. Paul's picture is really a nice example of this. So kind of to concise kind of a complicated account. So Paul basically suggests that it's a many mereological generalist monists assume that the fundamental constituents are basically something like the smallest spatial temporally located entities. As far as I can tell, she's got in her mind something quite close to what David Lewis thinks, but I'm not sure if it's quite what Lewis has in mind. So kind of the view that she thinks that most generalist monists, mereological generalist monists tend to accept is the view that says that the fundamental constituents, the things that build everything else, are something like space-time points. However, Paul thinks that this is an assumption that we should reject. So the most important reason for our purposes today is that Paul basically suggests that the assumption that the fundamental constituents of reality are something like space-time points is not an assumption that's made by our best fundamental physics. So it's unjustified for us as metaphysicians to build such an assumption into our theory of fundamental structures. So basically what Paul suggests instead is that we should treat the fundamental constituents of reality as something like properties or qualities, where those things are something like, or quite like, Aristotelian universals. So they're sort of things that are multiply realizable, can be instantiated by many things. Sorry, not multiply realizable, multiply instantiatable. And they're the sort of things that exist only if they can be instantiated by something else. Essentially, Paul's thought is that the ontological category of properties appropriately described is sufficiently general to accommodate for the epistemic possibility that space-time might turn out not to be fundamental. Because if space-time turns out not to be fundamental, then we can't say that the fundamental constituents of reality are something like space-time points. Okay, now this leads her into some claims concerning how composition relations behave, at least how this fundamental composition relation behaves. Here's why. So a consequence of this picture, this combination of thinking of the fundamental constituents as properties and meological genus monism, is that sort of non-fundamental things, so objects, events, everything else, that's not fundamental, they turn out to be meological fusions of properties, right? And that from this, it's going to follow that properties are proper parts of their bearers, right? So on Paul's picture, say, she has kind of some classical universals in her ontology, so like shapes. So this picture entails that shapes are proper parts of their bearers. But this raises the worry that since proper parthood is transitive, it's going to commit us to the claim that having a proper part with some property is sufficient for you having that property. So to go back to the hand example, since I've got a thing that has hand shape, that's my proper part, and proper part is transitive, the worry is that Paul's picture is going to commit us to the view that I am hand shaped in virtue of having something that's hand shaped as a proper part. That seems obviously wrong. And the way she avoids this unattractive consequence is by doing two things. The first thing is kind of what I'm interested in here, but I'll mention the second thing for clarity. So she firstly restricts the fundamental composition relation in a way that the only things that properly compose something are the fundamental constituents. That is the basic, simple properties. And this is the principle I've got labeled in your handout as exclusivity. And secondly, she introduces an additional non-fundamental kind of composition and parthood that she calls spatial temporal composition, and says that that's the composition relations that hold and parthood relations that hold between non-fundamental spatial temporally located things. So the idea is that basically we block the problematic transitivity of the hand-shapedness from my hand to me by saying that, well, the kind of a part that these basic properties are of the things that have them is of a different sort than the kind of a part the hand is, sort of a part that the hand is of me, whatever. So thought is the hand is a spatial temporal part of me, but the property, since the property of hand-shapedness is a qualitative proper part of the hand, it doesn't follow that I'm hand-shaped. And basically the idea is that, look, the way the non-fundamental are composed of the fundamental or is of a different kind of composition as the way that the non-fundamental compose or are composed of their non-fundamental parts. And it's only the first kind of composition that's building for the Paul. So it's only sort of the property composition that's the kind of fundamental composition relation. So that's the way she avoids this problem of transitivity. Okay, so these principles, if formulated as I've done it, are going to lead us to a puzzling consequence. And this is the consequence that there's precisely one thing that the fundamental constituents properly compose, and that thing is the world. In other words, this entails that there's precisely one non-fundamental entity and the fundamental entities. So to start, notice that proper fusion and plus the exclusivity claim of proper fusing is going to entail that proper parthood is vacuously transitive. That is, if you put these two claims together, it follows that every proper part is a simple, and therefore no complex is a proper part. The compositional structure of reality is at most two-layered. So you've got the fundamental simples, and then you've got the non-fundamental complexes that the fundamental simples build. So I've got like a proof on your handout. I'm not going to go through it, but I'll sort of give you the rough details. So it follows directly from the notion of proper fusion that every complex properly fuses its proper parts. And therefore, from this, it follows that every proper part is among some things that properly compose something, namely the proper parts of the thing that is a proper part of. So every complex properly fuses its proper parts, and every proper part is among some things that composes something. But then if you put this together with exclusivity, which is the claim that all things that properly compose something are simple, it follows that all proper parts are simple. That is, that proper parts is vacuously transitive. Okay, so that's the first bit of the way to raise the problem. The second is to look at the composition intuition. Well, the composition intuition says that there's a world, that is, there's something that has everything as its proper parts, and that thing has the fundamental constituents as proper parts. Now, if for vacuous transitivity, every proper part is simple, then the world has no proper parts that are complex. So since everything is a part of the world has to be the only complex. Because if there was a complex that was a proper part of the world, there would be a complex that is a proper part. But vacuous transitivity says that no complex is a proper part. So all that there is are the fundamental constituents and a single thing that they compose. Now, just to be clear why I think it's an unacceptable consequence, well, it's just going to entail a radically revisionary ontology that is not plausible, and sort of even on a sort of very kind of strange, metaphysical taste, you might call it. Because not only does this threaten to rule out the existence of sort of the things in our manifest image, like tables and chairs, etc., but it's going to threaten to rule out the existence of most entities postulated by any sciences, be it physics, chemistry, biology, economics, psychology, right? Because the consequence above says that if you want to have something in your ontology, you have to say that it is basically either the world or a fundamental constituents, something that is mereologically simple and that isn't composed of anything else. So the only way to get galaxies or animals or H2O molecules and so on under ontology on this picture would be to claim that they are fundamental constituents of reality. And I just don't see any plausible way of motivating this. Okay, so that's a problem. So how might a mereological journalist monist avoid this problem? Well, I think there's two plausible responses, right? So the first response entails giving up on the composition intuition and the idea that the world is a particular with a mereological structure. So I think here my thought would be that, well, kind of following what Peter Simmons suggested, and Einar Lunger-Bøhn has also kind of mentioned in some of his papers, we might treat the world not as a singular term that picks out this massive individual, but we might think of it as a plural term that means all the things. So it's kind of the massively, it's the maximal plural term. It literally just refers to everything that exists, plurally. However, this is going to require giving up on this mereological notion of the world. And it's also going to require on giving up the thought that we can think of the composition intuition in mereological terms. And the reason for this is that fusion and composition are, conceived of standardly in mereology, always in mereology as far as I can tell, as relations that hold between a singular thing, the thing that's composed, and many things, the composers, right? But if so, we can't interpret the claim the fundamental constituents build the world by mereology composing it as a claim about mereological composition, because the world is a plural term, right? So it's just going to be ends up being ill-formed. Okay, the second response. Well, this response is to drop exclusivity. So the thought here is that we allow for properly transitive parted and composition relations, and so we can allow the world to be the top level of parted and composition. So we can have like multiple layers of composition, and we can say that the world is kind of top level of composition. However, I do think that it's hard to drop exclusivity if we go with something like Paul's line of thought, and construe the fundamental constituents of reality as properties for precisely the reasons as mentioned above. The root of the problem, as far as I can see, is that it's just that the way that things that have properties relate to the properties that they have, so the way properties relate to their bearers, is just not obviously a transitive relation, unlike parted is classically thought to be. So if we call this relation instantiation, since it seems that instantiation is not a transitive relation, a mereology that has properties in its domain and thinks that properties relate to their bearers by composition, it's just going to look radically different from any sort of standard mereology that one finds in the literature. And since it seems that, instantiation, I just said that bit. So, okay, so what I just said is that it looks like we're going to have a really weird mereology if we think of mereology as a thing that governs instantiation relations. And given this, and sort of given that as I've suggested, that you only need really a really basic mereology to derive this consequence. I'm sort of worried that, well, if we end up having to give up on the transitivity of parthood to have a quote-unquote mereology of properties, it's just not clear that the sort of relations that we end up calling composition and parthood are really composition and parthood relations, while there's things that have that name, right? The worry is that you might wonder to what extent the ensuing formal theory is a theory of a parthood relation and a composition relation, rather of sort of sui generis relations that we call parthood and composition. Okay, so let me now conclude by drawing out what I think is the main upshot here. So I think mereological generalist monism is naturally paired with the conception of the fundamental as something like minimal spatial-temporal points. However, I do think that there are reasons to think that that should not be an assumption that we as metaphysicians build into our account of fundamentality. And if that's right, then it looks like a property-based account of the fundamentals is kind of tempting. However, I think the argument above suggests that there are problems with thinking that the relations between properties and their bearers behave like parthood and composition relations do. And this raises the worry that if properties are the fundamental constituents, then it's just not clear that a mereological approach to building is the one that we ought to take. So I do think that there's a tension between mereological generalist monism and thinking that the fundamental constituents of reality are something like properties. And so if properties are the fundamental constituents of reality, then if we kind of, for me to answer the question that I've raised in my title, can we build the world from composed of its fundamental constituents? My worry is that if properties are fundamental constituents of reality, then I'm not sure if the world can be composed of its fundamental constituents. Okay, thanks.